Hello, you have found Why We Are Christians, a weekly television show in which we have conversational interviews with very interesting people who have come to faith in Jesus. And today I am with somebody I have known for several years, and his name is Rob Wertheim. And I love to welcome you, Rob Wertheim.
Thank you, Katie. It's good to be here.
And thank you for being on our show. I know we have tried for actually a few years to find a time when we can make this happen.
Right.
And I really appreciate that you were able to make it here today.
It's a pleasure.
Yes. And so we are going to talk about how somebody like yourself came to faith in what the Jews call Yeshua. Yes, the Jews. And that is because you are Jewish. So my first question has to be to you. How did you start life in terms of your place of birth, your family of origin, how your childhood was? What kind of influences were most important for you?
Sure. Well, I grew up in New York City, the old country, as we like to say. And my parents, by the way, are Holocaust survivors from Germany.
We'll hear more about that later.
Yes. And so as I was growing up in New York, I was raised in a conservative Jewish family. Okay.
And so explain to people what that means.
What that means is I used to go to Hebrew school for 4 years. It's an after-school program. And I learned how to daven or pray. I learned some of the more famous Bible stories. And I learned about the festivals. And then at the age of 13, I had my bar mitzvah, which is a coming of age for Jewish people. And so that was pretty much how I grew up. Yeah.
Okay, so needless to say, there wasn't much talking about Jesus.
Absolutely nothing.
In your childhood. Were there any, did you even know Christians?
Not that I was aware of. I mean, I always assumed, being that I was Jewish, that anybody that was not Jewish was a Christian. And so for me, a Christian was synonymous with being not Jewish.
Okay, so you didn't consider other religions like Buddhists or Hindus or even Muslims? That was just kind of so far away that it didn't even register?
Right. Well, living in New York at the time, the majority of folks that were in our neck of the woods were people that were, I would have considered Christians back then. That they weren't Jewish, but they were Christian. Of course, obviously, there are other religions and all, but because the majority of people that I knew or neighbors or friends or whatever, they weren't Jewish. I just assumed that they were Christians.
And this part of New York was which?
I lived in Queens.
Queens. So most people, I think, know that Brooklyn is like this, where it's so predominantly Jewish, or it was, that you barely have to even think about anything else.
That's true. Yeah. I think Queens would be considered maybe the stepchild of Brooklyn.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you said something a couple minutes ago about your parents and that fact that they are what's called Holocaust survivors. Please give us not just a definition of what that means, but start to flesh that out in terms of who they were, where they came from, what happened to them.
Sure. Well, I'll start with my mother. My mother and her parents left Germany in 1936, and my grandfather, my mother's father, was a butcher at the time, and as they say, he saw the writing on the walls that something was going on that was not going to be a good thing for the Jewish people in Germany, and so he decided to move to the U.S. In my father's case, My father had two sisters and his parents, of course. And in 1938, there was what's called Kristallnacht. And that was a night of broken glass where the Nazis would come in and they would destroy synagogues. They would break the glass windows of the synagogues. They would destroy the Torah scrolls, things like that.
And
in November.
The shop windows of any Juden.
That's right. That's right. And in the case of my father told me stories of how my grandfather was taken outside their house, and my father witnessed Nazis beating my grandfather and even knocking his teeth out, and then they took him away. Yeah. And we found out, my dad's family found out, that he was taken to Buchenwald, a concentration camp.
Never heard of again?
Well, actually, my grandfather had served honorably during World War I in the German army, because back then, Jews were conscripted into the army. They had to serve. Mm-hmm. And my grandfather served very honorably, and he earned the Iron Cross.
Oh.
Now, that was a large award, yes. A great award.
Yes.
And for somebody who is considered a hero. And my dad and his family lived in a small village. And so the fact that my grandfather had won the Iron Cross, they were able to go to the Burgermeister, the mayor of the village, and they had that medal in hand, and they were able to demonstrate that my grandfather was a hero in World War I. And because of that medal, they were able to get him out of Buchenwald.
Wow.
And he was able to return home, though my father has told stories that when my grandfather came home, he told stories of how the conditions were so terrible that he saw men throw themselves against electrified fences in order to die in Buchenwald, because that's how bad it was.
Wow.
Yeah. So my grandfather came home, and due to the quota system back then with the U.S., it took 3 years until they were actually able to emigrate to the United States. Back then, you had to prove that you had a relative that already was living in the United States that would vouch for the family to make sure that they would take care of their material needs so that they wouldn't become wards of the state. So they had a distant relative living in the U.S., and they were willing to do that for my parents, for my father and his parents and his two sisters. Okay. So they moved in 1941. But what really gets interesting, Katie, I don't know if you know this, is that my dad was so angry with what had happened to my grandfather that 2 years after they immigrated to the United States, my father joined the U.S. Army.
Oh.
And he wanted to go back to Germany, to the village they were from, to find those who had beaten up my grandfather so that he could get even.
Of course, he wouldn't have had that decision or freedom to do such.
Well, of course not. But he did join the Army.
Yes.
He landed on D-Day with the 1st Infantry Division.
Yes.
He survived that.
That's amazing to begin with.
He survived the Battle of the Bulge.
Yes.
And then he got captured by the Germans.
Oh, no.
And so...
But now he's a fluent German speaker.
Right. And so what happened was he knew that the German soldiers were talking about killing my father, as well as the other guys that had got captured with him. And fortunately, they never went through with it. And they didn't know my father was a German Jewish person either.
Okay.
And so they were put into a Starlog, into a prisoner of war camp.
Yes.
And he was there for about 30 days, if I remember right.
Yes.
And then it was near the end of the war.
Yes.
And so he and the guys were liberated by the British.
Okay. My goodness. Okay, so let's bring this into a little bit closer time period. I too could talk about stories my father, who was of German descent, could tell for being in the U.S. Army right as the war was ending and what he experienced in that position. It was really, it completely shattered his whole appreciation for his background as a German.
Right.
Okay, so now we are with your parents in this country, and you're not around yet.
Right.
Bring us into your being here.
Okay. Well, I have an older brother named Steve. He's 7 years older than me.
Yes.
So I was born 7 years later. And my brother and I both grew up, as I said, conservative Jewish.
Mm-hmm.
And then by the time my brother was in his early 20s, he was an atheist or an agnostic.
Mm-hmm.
He was living in New York. He had finished college. And he decided that he wanted to move out to California.
How unusual.
Well, avoid those winters and all of that, of course. And so we were always a very close-knit family.
Yes.
And Steve didn't know anybody in Southern California. So my father decided to drive across country with Steve in his little Volkswagen Beetle, affectionately named Herbie. For all of those who remember the love bug.
Okay.
And to make sure that my brother got settled, that he found an apartment.
Okay.
He didn't have a job or anything like that. So he drove with my brother. They got to L.A. They found an apartment in Hollywood. And that was one of the places they were told, don't look in Hollywood because that's where all the weirdos live.
Okay.
But you know what? They found an apartment in Hollywood.
Yes.
And what was really attractive, for my father at least, was that the apartment manager was a sweet Jewish woman from Great Britain by the name of Lily.
Okay.
And she had a twinkle in her eye, and she said to my father, Fred, if Steve takes the apartment, just give me your phone number back in New York. And if he has any problems, I'm going to give you a call.
Keep him in line.
That's right. And it was like an insurance policy for my father. He loved the idea. And my understanding is they went back to the motel that night. My brother said, I don't like it. There's no swimming pools. There's no palm trees. Let's keep looking. My father said, you don't have a job. It's a good deal. Take it. You can always move later.
Yes. And
so
Steve
took the apartment.
Okay, good. So let's get us, what year do you think that would be?
This was in 1974.
No, 74. Okay, so we're getting closer to the subject of why you're here.
That's right. Yeah.
So what happened to Steve that then kind of washed into you?
Well, as I said, Lily was a Jewish woman, the apartment manager. She had a twinkle in her eye. There was something very special about her, and my dad couldn't put his finger on it.
Yeah.
Well, as it turned out, Lily was actually a Jewish believer in Jesus.
Oh, my goodness.
And as I said, Steve had been an atheist or an agnostic. And my understanding, of course, it's third party, is that Steve, in his loneliness, he didn't have any friends initially when he moved. Lily used to invite him over for tea or coffee or whatever.
She knew what she was doing.
And we found out that she was a believer. And so she used to leave gospel tracts, information about Jesus on her coffee table. And she used to share with Steve. And then she put him in touch with the early LA office of Jews for Jesus.
Okay.
Now, when we spoke to Steve at one point by phone, we found out that he was going to Bible studies on Friday nights. Now, we were scratching our heads. We were wondering,
Bible studies?
Bible studies? He's an atheist. He's an agnostic. Who goes to a Bible study like that on Friday nights? And he's Jewish, so Friday nights, Bible studies, Onik Shabbat service.
Yeah, so they were thinking that he was going to synagogue Bible studies or something like that?
Exactly.
Oh, okay.
So
he wasn't saying then, where he was going for these and what what part of the Bible that he was
That's correct.
studying.
That's right. And so I had spring break from high school. It was around Passover, Easter. And I decided I was going to take a trip out to California and visit my brother Steve and freeload for a week.
Okay.
So he picked me up at the airport, and my first question to him was, so Steve, what's this about Bible studies? I thought you don't believe in God. Well, Steve said to me, actually, Rob, I do believe in God. And you know what else? I believe that the Messiah has come. So I thought,
when? Who?
right. I thought, are you nuts? Are you meshuggah, as we say? We all know he hasn't come yet. He's going to come someday. He's going to bring peace to the world. So I said, you're crazy. What are you talking about? He said, no, really. I believe that the Messiah has come. And I don't want you to get mad, but do you know who I believe it is? So I said, okay, go ahead. Tell me. And he said, I believe it's Jesus.
And you went,
how could you do such a thing? How could you do such a thing to mom and dad after what they went through in the Holocaust, leaving Germany finally and all? How could you do such a thing? You've become a traitor to our people.
And let's just say that this is the typical reaction, or at least it used to be the typical reaction. Mm-hmm. You're a traitor. You're an enemy of our people.
Right. You were one of us. You've become one of them.
Yeah. You're condemning our family to hell just by believing in this Jesus. Okay.
That's right. And Steve said, no, I'm still Jewish, but I believe that he was the promised Messiah of the Tanakh, of the Jewish scriptures. So anyway, he took me back to his apartment. He told me that there was going to be a Passover Seder, which is a Jewish observance of Passover, and he wanted me to come with him to the Seder. And he warned me, he said, it's not a traditional one. It's being held by this organization that I'm connected with called Jews for Jesus. So I said,
you had already heard of them.
I had heard about them a little bit.
And we know, we just have to say that the phrase Jews for Jesus was not chosen by the founder, Moshe Rosen. It was actually placed from the outside as almost a derogatory thing.
Right.
Of, oh, you, Jews, yeah, right, you're for Jesus, ha ha.
Right. So, I thought about that, and then I also thought about the fact, look, it's Passover, and I'm going to go to a Seder, even if these people that are with him are as meshuggah as him. I'm still going to go. And so I went, and it was like no other Seder I'd ever been to before, because for the first time in my life, at the age of 16, I was looking at messianic prophecy from the Jewish scriptures, passages that seemed to talk about Jesus. And I couldn't wrap my mind around it. It seemed so strange. Mm-hmm. Why hadn't I heard about this before? Mm-hmm. Well, the Passover Seder ended. I went back to my brother's apartment. There was a movie on TV. The second part of it was on, called The Greatest Story Ever Told, which is on the life of Jesus. And I'm hearing things during the movie we're watching that I thought I had heard during the Passover Seder earlier that night. And it made a lot of sense. And then my brother's friend, who was the office leader, the branch leader of the LA office, his name was Baruch, he invited me to go with him the next day for some touring to Universal Studios. He figured, well, Rob probably wants to do some touring. I'd like to share with him about the Messiah. So that's a good connection.
Right.
So I went with Baruch, and he shared with me, and then he gave me a book called The Late Great Planet Earth by Hal Lindsey.
Yes.
And back in 1975, that was on the top 10 bestseller list.
Yes, that was a big deal. Mm-hmm.
And I took it, and before I left, my brother Steve said, please, whatever you do, don't tell Mom and Dad about me. And I said, no worries. I'm not going to start World War III.
However,
well, I went back to New York. I didn't say anything. I kept my word. I read the book, in fact, on the airplane as best as I remember it. And I was growing closer and closer, considering maybe there's some truth to this. Mm-hmm. Then, it was maybe about a month later, my parents were very upset with my brother because Steve used to call almost every other day when he first moved to California. All of a sudden, he wasn't calling too often, maybe once a week, if that, because he had friends and he had a job by this point, whatever. And so my mom decided the next time he calls, I'm going to give him a little bit of Jewish guilt. And this is how it
you
worked.
don't love me anymore, you don't call.
That's right. So Steve called. We answer the phone. You know, we had 3 phone extensions back in New York. And she realizes it's Steve, and she says, oh, hello. And Steve said, Mom, is there something wrong? And she said, oh, nothing. So he said, come on, I know something's wrong. Did Rob tell you I believe in Jesus? And that's how they found out. And for the next hour, there was a transcontinental argument going on across the, on the phones. And
was there like a lot of yelling and?
There was a lot of yelling. There was tears.
Yeah.
And
how could you do this to us?
Right.
Yeah.
So we got off the telephone, and I found myself defending my brother. I was not a believer in Jesus by any means at this point, but I kind of understood where he was coming from. Yes. I understood he hadn't abandoned his identity as a Jew, that he was still 100% Jewish. And so I tried to explain that to them. Yes. And then, about maybe another month later, Baruch and his wife, Marcia, were coming to New York on ministry-related business.
Of course.
And they wanted to meet my parents. They'd already met me. My father, when he heard that, he said, no way. If they come, I'm throwing them off our terrace. We lived on the 12th floor of our apartment building. And so I said, no, you got to let them come because they can explain better than I can about what Steve is into these days. Yeah. And my parents gave in. Yeah. In fact, my mom baked, I think, and she cooked and all this stuff. They came, they shared from the scriptures about Jesus, from the Old Testament, from the Jewish scriptures, the prophecies. And my mom and dad fell in love with Brooke and Marcia. And it started to make a bit of sense to them, but they still were not believers either, by any means. Then there was a concert that was going to be happening in Lower Manhattan in Greenwich Village, an outdoor concert by a singing team that Jews for Jesus used to have called the Liberated Wailing Wall.
Yeah, it wasn't that many years ago that they didn't have it anymore.
That's true. And so we were invited to go, and mind you, this is June.
Yes.
It's dark, it's overcast, and it's humid, and it felt like it was going to rain any minute. Well, they performed, they did their music, they did their drama, they packed up their instruments and everything, equipment. We walked over to our car, and then as my dad started up the car, what do you think happens? Thunder, lightning, lots of rain. And as we're driving off, my mom leans over at my father and says, hey, Freddie, you think they have connections?
Okay.
And so I wondered the same thing in the back seat there. And then another month later, we went out to California to visit my brother and spend vacation with him for a few weeks. Some things that had happened were, to me, more than a coincidence, family matters that I'm not going to get into right now, but it had to do with my grandmother. And so my grandmother had passed, actually, while we were away. And you could imagine my father, it's my father's mother. My grandfather had passed away many years ago before I even knew him. But it would have been pretty devastated. At the same time, my dad was in California. By the time we found out, she had already been buried.
Oh, yeah, because people might not know that in Judaism you have to be buried
the next day
within 24 hours, 48
and
hours.
within
like
24 hours. And we had been on a trip in the midst of the vacation, and we didn't have cell phones back then. We didn't have computers, internet, any of that. And so by the time my aunt spoke to my father, it was too late. So we continued our vacation out there. But I felt like it was more than a coincidence. God cared about what went on. And then, let's see, what happened next? So we attended a couple of Bible studies. We were invited to go to some Jews for Jesus Bible studies where Steve was going.
Okay.
In Los Angeles.
In Los Angeles. Okay, so you're back there.
And then at one point, my mother said to me, "Rob, do you believe this stuff too?" And this was at the study. And I said, "Well, Mom, I'm not sure. I don't really know." Because I saw how they reacted to my brother. So we went back to New York. And in the fall of 1975, Jews for Jesus opened its New York branch.
Okay.
And we were invited to go to the Bible studies on Tuesday nights. And my parents and I, we ended up going. We were like charter members, if you will,
Okay.
for the Bible study. And then one night, and by this time my dad had a Bible, we had a homework assignment. A full Bible. And so our homework was to read from the first letter of John.
Okay.
Now, what do we know about the New Testament, let alone even the Jewish scriptures, the Old Testament? So my dad wanted to do the homework. So he started flipping through Matthew, Mark, Luke. It was the New Testament. He gets to the Gospel of John, chapter 1.
Yeah.
And 1 John, right? John 1, 1 John.
Okay. He didn't know the difference.
Nope.
And so
he read the first chapter. He liked
this is a big deal, this first chapter of the Gospel of John.
Oh, yeah. He loved it so much he read the whole Gospel.
Oh, wow.
And then, if that weren't enough, one night, maybe a few nights later, he woke up in the middle of the night and he saw a shadowy figure standing at the door of his bedroom.
Yes.
And he believed that it was Jesus.
Okay.
The next day, he met with the branch leader of the New York office, and he actually committed his life to the Lord. He received Jesus as his Messiah. And then he came home later that day, and we found out, and I was already just about there. I mean, I had not committed my life to the Lord, but I was already, I think, a believer. So the next day I met with the same fellow, and I committed my life to the Lord.
Okay. Guess what? We are going to pick right up at that moment in time in our next show, because right now I have to say goodbye to the folks who are watching, and we are very happy that you have found why we are Christians, and our interview with Rob Wertheim will continue in our next show. So long.